Evening. We will go ahead and start. We're expecting a few more folks, but we'll go ahead and honor people's time and go ahead and start. I am not passing out new slides this week. Why is that? Because we just started talking about universals last week, and there were a lot of people sitting there with a semi-blank stare. So we're going to use the same slides from last week and talk more. But as we begin that, does anybody remember what the homework was? We had homework the last 2 weeks, and the first week's homework there was to come up with an example of a universal. We talked about a couple of them last week, and we'll go back to some of those. The second bit of homework from last week was to come up with a syllogism. And so we're going to play with those and talk about deductive reasoning in the context of talking about universals and syllogisms. You're right. I'm confusing the homework from the first week, which was to come up with a universal and see if we could apply it in a syllogism. Right. And then this week we're talking about formal causation. Good job. Thank you. So I assume Jim is the one who's done the homework then. So, but let's go back and talk about universals, okay? And we were given a couple examples by people last week, such as fire produces heat. And I think we also had that the sun produces light, or radiant energy, let's call it that. Does anybody remember any of the other examples that people used? Okay, we said that a physical constant like gravity would be a universal, right? Okay, right. Water, when it freezes, expands by 8.97% in volume, right? What else did we use as examples? Some physical constants. Pretty much all of those were physical constants. Tom?
I was wondering about this, and I don't know the answers. Is consciousness a universal? It doesn't matter whether I'm alive or not, but consciousness still exists to others, and things like that.
What is necessary for consciousness?
A receiver. Consciousness is kind of like a radio wave out in the distance, and I'm the radio. And I'm tapping into that. And then, as I get older, that radio may not work as well. But that consciousness, stream of thought.
Okay, you're saying that consciousness is external to the individual mind then. And so if we say that consciousness requires a mind in order for you to have the experience of consciousness. And so the first question we'd have to explore would be how we define consciousness. Then we'd have to explore how it was defined only with reference to the experience of consciousness, or if it could be an objective thing outside of us that we participate in. That would be one possibility, right? Jim?
How about perception of self and objects in space and time?
Okay. As we experience consciousness, we'd probably start using definitions that would include what you just described, the experience of self in space and time. In psychology, we would talk about proprioceptive sensing, right? And my proprioception is a consciousness of self in space and time. But we could probably come up with examples from neurology where that would be altered, or we couldn't prove it in the existence of an individual we'd otherwise say is human, right? So all of what Tom has described and what you've described are all sort of going around the problem of mind. And it's a fascinating problem that we will explore, but I think it is a few steps away from where we're going right now on what's a universal. Fair enough? So let's park those for now. What we've talked about in universals so far is things like, well, here's a question for you to park there. Is consciousness possible without language or some other form of communication? Right? Is consciousness a construct of language, for example? Park that. We've talked about physical constants, you know, the 6 cosmological constants. We've talked about the strong and weak nuclear forces, gravity. We've talked about, there are 4. Wait a minute. There's strong and weak nuclear force, gravity, and electromagnetism. Okay. We talk about the speed of light, we talked about, right? The speed of light, let's take the speed of light as an example. How fast is light? 186,000 miles per second, right? 300,000 kilometers per second if we're going to be proper internationalists here. Long before any of us decided what a mile is, long before any of us decided what a second is, long before any of us decided what a kilometer is, the speed of light was the same, right? And so that's independent of how we define the measurement, right? And so it starts looking like something that does not require, well, let's go back and look at how we defined universals. And we said what? That it could be a property, a quantity or relation that 2 or more entities have in common. It could be a mathematical entity. It could be a proposition that is either universally true or universally false, or statements about reality, propositional statements. We said that a universal is something that does not require, that universals are real not as ideas within a mind, and so a universal can exist independent of the existence of a human mind. This is going to take us, by the time we're going through Aristotle and Aquinas, to saying, does this require the existence of a universal mind? And Aristotle is going to argue for God on that basis, and Thomas Aquinas is going to develop that. But again, we're not there yet. If we sit there and say something independent of mind, we can look at physical constants. We can look at numbers. We can look at propositions that are universally true or false. Now, as much as whichever side of this equation you might be on, in terms of whether this is a statement that pleases you or not, if I say on the 1st of October, 2018, Donald Trump was President of the United States, that's a proposition, right? And it doesn't matter if we all died on the 2nd of October and all records of human existence were extinguished on the 2nd of October. The fact that Donald Trump was president on the 1st of October would still be true because it actually happened, right? So let's play with propositional statements a minute. That's the example of a conditional propositional statement that is true because it's objectively real. Some of us think we're hallucinating some of the times. Some of us wish we were hallucinating some of the times. But if it is objectively real external to us, it's a propositional truth, even if it's conditional, because it would have always, of course, be possible that on the 1st of October somebody wasn't president. We didn't have a president, right? What about a propositional statement that is not conditional? And that's where some of you went. Fire produces heat. The sun produces visible light, or an electromagnetic spectrum that to us is visible in certain wavelengths. There could be no human beings, and as long as the sun is in existence, the sun would be producing electromagnetic radiation that would include a wavelength that, if there were human beings, would be within a visible spectrum, right? What else? That is non-conditional.
That includes sound, then?
Sure, but what do you...
If you fell in the woods and nobody was there to hear, did it still make a sound? So the light waves, the sun produces light, whether you're there to see it or not.
Well, that is kind of the tree falls in a forest, but that itself is actually a thought experiment, not a philosophical statement, but let's play with it. What happens when a tree falls? Stuff gets moved around. As long as it's not in a vacuum, air gets displaced. And a waveform is propagated through the air that relates to what got hit at what speed, all those other things that we would quantify and qualify sound by. And that waveform propagates. Nobody's there to hear it, right? Now, the thought problem of if a tree falls in a forest is the problem about what is sound. And does it require someone to perceive it to qualify as sound, or is it otherwise, just a waveform that's propagating through this medium we call air and earth and water and, So the same could be said about, electromagnetism coming off the sun. If we assume for a minute that we are good Ptolemaic people and that the earth is the center of the universe and the only intelligent life in the universe is on earth and that we are the apple of God's eye and part of God's great plan. If we make all of those assumptions, which most of humanity has for most of human history, the necessary corollary then is that any planet discovered in the Crab Nebula isn't inhabited. Right? If we say the only intelligent life in the world, the universe, in creation, is here. Let's come closer than the Crab Nebula. Let's go to Mars. Mars actually has a very thin atmosphere, right? And so there is a medium that can propagate sound. And so there's a rock slide on Mars. Who's there to hear it? There's a waveform. It's going through a very thin atmosphere. It's going through the other rocks. It could be, right? But could be little green men showing up. And so the question there would be, is that sound? Or is it something else that wouldn't be sound because no one's there to hear it? If we have a little NASA bot going around on wheels, and it can sense that and transmit the waveform to us, and somebody sitting at NASA hears it go, again, now we've got...
Are they hearing things? Don't they have scientists sitting with earphones and watching the screens, hearing stuff from outer space now?
What do they hear?
What do they hear? They hear something.
Well, I'm sorry? The music of the spheres? Oh. Okay, this brings back the issue that their mind, their perception makes it into hearing something.
But doesn't that go back to what you're talking about consciousness? It depends on how we define sound. We have to agree upon that definition, or we can say that sound exists, both there, and then if it's just in our mind.
And as soon as we start arguing about language or about definitions, we start arguing about language, which loops us right back to, is consciousness a construct of language?
So it's that
Same argument. Now, these are all kind of interesting questions, but you see where we run into a problem as soon as we start saying that things are universals because of how they're experienced. That we can experience light, that we can experience sound. The whole is greater than the part, okay. Doesn't need to be experienced. 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't need to be experienced. I think what Eric is getting at is taking the problem of universals outside of perception, divorcing it from the need for perception. Because what we're trying to play with here on universals is we are used to perceiving things. That's how we exist. To really, really, really be what we're going to say for deductive reasoning purposes, a universal is, it is a universal independent of perception, and we might discover it. And then discover it to be an objective reality external to ourselves that we might describe using things like visible wavelength or heat or something. Yes, Tom?
Do we discover it using perception, or do we discover it using logic outside of perception? Is there, so if we discover it using perception, then we go back to the problem of, is it independent of perception?
Well, let's use mathematics as an example. Long before we defined numbers of any kind, early humans, at some point, if you took four pieces of paper, would perceive things. They wouldn't think of them as four things, but they'd recognize them immediately as different from those things or those things. And so the concept of numbers starts developing in mind, and the concept of numbers starts developing in terms of language. But the reality of fourness, or four, the reality that 2 + 2 = 4 is independent of whether there's ever a mind to perceive it or not. An early human mind, I'm sorry, Bobby? Yeah, I think you're right about that. Right? I think you're right about that. So there are things that are external to us that either need to be perceived and experienced or discovered. Do we perceive and experience the Pythagorean Theorem? At some point, mathematicians discovered well, let's say Pythagoras did this. At some point, Pythagoras figured out that there is a constant relationship between the sides and the square of a triangle, right? Maybe he did that with a lot of inductive reasoning to confirm it by measuring and measuring and measuring and measuring and measuring. Now, if you go back to the time of the ancient Greeks, how would they define real intelligence? No, intelligence. How would you qualify as being a person that was noted to be intelligent? Yeah, you got to do math. It's math. Intelligence is defined with reference to mathematical ability. Because imagine doing math before you have a decimal system of counting and something convenient like Arabic numerals, and trying to do just a basic addition or subtraction equation, let alone a geometric proof. You've got to be able to keep so many different things going in your head that you really are wired differently than the average person. Elizabeth used to have an uncle by marriage, now dead, who was a professor of mathematics at Davidson University. Is that college? Davidson? Yeah. And I was talking to him at some wedding rehearsal or something, and his specialty was topology. And so the mathematics of dimensions and shapes and things of that sort. And I told him that it's hard enough to think in 3 dimensions, and we try to think in 4, but to do topology, correctly, you have to be able to think in more than 4 dimensions. And he pointed out to me that to do topology correctly, you have to be able to think in n dimensions, an indeterminate number of dimensions. And this actually may intersect with reality at a quantum level, because when we start looking at subatomic particle physics, or what we still call particle physics, we start saying that this subatomic particle has what characteristics? Well, it has mass, has velocity or energy state, and we can quantify those in a couple different ways. And then when we start looking at things like quarks and other things, we say whether it has charm and what color it is. And, there are like 5 different states that I can't remember right now. And it looks like what we would consider to be charm, or what's defined by charm, as charm, is something different from what we can measure as mass or energy state that doesn't show up on our regular way of looking at things. It's like it's a different dimension beyond our 3 physical dimensions in time. Scientists come up with names for things, sometimes just on a lark. If you look at the names of genetic sequences, you can look through patent records and say, what's the name of this sequence that's useful for producing recombinant version of paclitaxel, instead of trying to harvest all these U. pacifica trees and destroying all the trees to make Taxol for breast cancer. Paclitaxel is based on a genetic sequence that's called Pac-Man. And there's also Donkey Kong, and, there is Notch, and, you get to name it in your patent application, right? I worked for a company. Our whole technology was based on a genetic sequence called Notch. Now that actually had a somewhat it would modify T-cell response, but Notch was named Notch because you test things in fruit flies because you can get thousands of generations in real time. And this particular sequence, which did interesting things with T cells in mice and human beings, caused a notch to form in fruit flies' wings. So you called it Notch. But if you wanted to call it Mike, you could, right? There are no naming conventions for genetic sequences. There are naming conventions for molecules. The International Adopted Names Convention has been ratified by most countries, and so if you're going to call something as a new molecule, you have to call it a certain way. It doesn't exist for genetic sequences, so you can get creative and say, Ahuehueteotl or something like that. Name it after an Aztec god. Yes, you can do complex mathematics using Roman numerals. But you'll go crazy trying as somebody who didn't learn that from the get-go. You can do all this in Chinese numerals. You can do this in a lot of different numerical systems. And we can have a counting system that's base 2, which is what all our computers work on, right? We could have base 12, like the ancient Babylonians, and there are certain advantages to counting in 12s rather than 10s. But in terms of what works for most people, 10 seems to have some advantages, right? So anything in math is something that exists independent of us. we had to discover it at some point. That starts looking like a universal that's independent of certainly the human mind. Now, as I say, Aristotle and Aquinas will say that universals are ideas in God's mind, and that they exist in God's mind, and that's why they're real, etc., etc. We'll develop that a little bit. But other than what we would consider to be mathematical formulae, propositions that are universally true or false, and provably true or false, universals, anything else we can think of? Come up with other examples? Go for a can of worms. Go for it. Okay. Worms. Okay. All philosophical systems require, as a basic law, the law of non-contradiction. Right? That's what you're saying. The law of non-contradiction is a universal in how deductive reasoning works, for example, right? A statement cannot be both true and false. That's the law of non-contradiction. And we get into trouble with that sometimes because we like to say that things could change depending on circumstance. Now, we can see in our culture wars, for example, that the law of non-contradiction would apply if we say that we are looking at moral and ethical problems, and we have to be able to say, for the law of non-contradiction to apply, that any moral principle, any ethical principle, is a universal external to our perception. Because other than that, morality just becomes somewhat situational and relativistic. The problem, and it is in a lot of our society, the problem once we say that a moral principle is objective and either has to be discovered to us or revealed to us by God or some higher power, is then we're going to start arguing, immediately start arguing about that. And so where we are right now in most Christian denominations is debates over what are called situational ethics. And of course, we all fudge those anyway. We would, I think, in the room basically agree that killing another human being is something we don't want to do. Would we agree that under all circumstances, at all times, killing another human being is indefensibly wrong? Well, we'd get into an argument over that. We'd get into an argument over self-defense. We'd get into an argument over just war. We'd get into, an argument over whether it's a human being, things like that. And so once we start talking about moral principles as revealed and as objective, we come right to the meat of some of our cultural debates. And we come right to the collision between a more ancient way of looking at thinking as involving things like universals and a more postmodern way of looking at things as a more nominalistic viewpoint saying there is no objective reality, it's just what we call it. There are no universals, they're just names for things. So a good nominalist would say, if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound because we've called our perception of that sound. And if we're not there to hear it, there's no sound. Now, that's a slightly different argument. But, yeah, universals, you see how we're sneakily going down the slope towards theology here. Universals pose the problem to us of objective and subjective knowledge. And what is revealed, discovered, external to us, and what is something that we have to think about and agree upon and define and come up with a convention to agree upon. Now, in this room, it's a high probability that if I were to say that it has been revealed to us in the design of creation that men are to rule women and that women have no, way to think independently and therefore they shouldn't have the vote or hold positions of responsibility. I think it highly probable that the people in this room would say, no, that's not a universal truth. That is a convention that was agreed upon because of these factors in the evolution of human societies. That it's not a reality of physiology and brain chemistry and all these other things. But we could find people in this town who could argue seriously that that's a universal truth. And we can certainly find Christian denominations that would argue that's a universal truth. And we can certainly find other thought systems, mainly non-Western, that would say, nope, that's it. It's a universal truth. Just this last Sunday, we had the passage from the 2nd chapter of Genesis where Eve is created out of Adam's rib, right? And you can find God knows how many theological arguments and sermons preached over the millennia about how this is, it means that man is to rule the woman because the woman has been taken out of the man. And we notice how it works the same in English as it does in Hebrew. In English, we get woman from the man. And in Hebrew, we have ish as man, and woman is isha from the man. And so we get right back into the problem of language and say, well, this is how we define patriarchy and superiority. And so patriarchy is a construct of language and not a universal. And it's a construct of, lots of things in the history of the evolution of human societies. But for millennia, there would have been people in pretty much all societies that would have said, the man is to rule the woman. And there's still plenty of people who'd say that, right? And so within our own lifetimes, in our own church, if we're Episcopalians, we've seen people say that a woman cannot, under any circumstance, be a priest. And they've made various arguments for that. But they've basically said that this is a universal reality and we can't change it, right? And we've seen counter-arguments to that, and we've seen the church move in the direction of having Mother Michelle sit here in holy orders. But again, go back 100 years and make an argument to somebody about women being priests in the Anglican communion. And they're going to look at you like you have two heads, right? Trivia question for you. Who's the first woman ordained in the Anglican communion? What year? 1976 in the Episcopal Church. 1942 in the Anglican communion. Li O Tim in Hong Kong. And there were no priests available, and so the good Anglicans who were in a particular part of Hong Kong decided that this very learned and pious woman, they'd go ahead and say, we're going to make her a priest. Now, to do that, you actually have to go down a particular Lutheran theological path to say how you ordain a priest. But if you get lesser feasts and fasts from 2006 on, you're going to find she's on our calendar, right? In 1976, when the Philadelphia 11 were ordained to the priesthood, was that recognized by the rest of the church? No, that was considered uncanonical and irregular. No. Carol was not one of the 11. No. She knew them personally. And what the 11 basically did, with others around them, was to say, we've talked for years about this issue, and everybody is saying it's not time yet, or we haven't been persuaded. So we're just going to do it and have some facts on the ground. And the net result, by the time General Convention started recognizing this, was that what percentage of the church left the Episcopal Church and formed other Anglican entities like the Anglican Province of Christ the King or the Anglo-Catholic Church of America, or et cetera, et cetera. They're like, what, there were 8 of them or something like that. Begs the question of what the Episcopal Church would be like today if all those folks had stayed, right? Now, and we've seen in our own lifetimes arguments over whether or not matrimony is something revealed by God as a universal plan between a man and a woman, or whether this is something that looks more like a human contract that we can bless in certain ways. And we are going to come up with, however many different people are in this room, we're going to come up with different opinions. I'm not using that as an example, but if I was going to use it as an example, I would say, in order to be a universal, it has to be a reality external to us, to our minds. It has to be a reality that is revealed to us. It has to be a reality that is discovered in that sense. The problem, of course, with matrimony as an example is, can you experience matrimony? Is matrimony real without minds? Well, one can posit certain physical relations between non-thinking beings. Happens all the time around us, right? Now, there's not a lot of thought involved in a lot that goes on around us. But matrimony, a marriage covenant, the giving of self, things like that, that kind of requires a certain... And we say, for example, if 2 children were claiming to be married, we wouldn't recognize that legally because we'd say they don't have the necessary mental capacity legally to enter into that kind of agreement. So universals are where we start getting the fault lines in the development of theology, but these fault lines do not really appear until very late in the development of theology. Even when you look at all of the theological debates in different Christian denominations and the Protestant Reformation and things of that sort, the arguments that are made in all of those debates are made with reference to universals, except to the extent that people are making nominalist arguments about the nature of reality. But then they're always, even the nominalists are going back to what they define as a standard external to themselves, which is Holy Scripture. So they treat Holy Scripture as a universal in that sense, as normative and external, and then argue about what it really means. So you get all kinds of arguments over the interpretation of Scripture. But nobody until pretty late in the game, 19th century, argues that none of this stuff is real anyway, and that therefore it's up to us to decide what it is. Nominalism exists as a philosophical position, but it doesn't start getting applied to how we behave as a human society until the 19th and 20th centuries. And by the 21st now, we're well into it in postmodernism. Dale. Facts on the ground, yeah. what I call the process of saying whether or not they're real bullets, whether they're words, and I'm going to meet your bullets with my nonviolence. But as soon as that type of exchange starts happening, we know who we are. Is that your argument, or DeBray's argument?
Well, that was his, yeah. Once they're shooting each other, they'll know who the
Okay, I wouldn't say that would relate to a universal. I say it would relate to human psychology and the nature of tribalism and self-interest. And, it's if we look at any election, there are people who are voted for on all sides of any equation that a lot of the voters hold their nose and pull the lever, right? It's like, I don't want to vote for this idiot, but it's to keep this idiot out of office or something like that. I wouldn't say that's your argument, if I'm taking you correctly, is that it's a universal of human behavior and psychology, that once we can define what self-interest is, we will act in self-interest. And in terms of probabilities and history of behavior, that certainly is the norm. But when we say, therefore, with angels and archangels and with all the company of saints, we start referring to people, saints, who by definition did not act in self-interest. And of course, we claim to follow a Lord who did not act in self-interest. Though he was in the form of God, yet he became a slave even unto death. Philippians 2:6. Dale's raising an interesting point, because when we think of universals, a lot of the way that we tend to default to thinking is common sense. And it is common sense and common experience that once people have their interests defined for them, even by an external force such as somebody shooting at you, they will act in self-interest. That's common sense, but we've just, using the example of the saints, said, but it's not a universal of human behavior. And so the common sense is going to trap us a lot in arguments, right? Doesn't mean that common sense is wrong in most cases, but there's always the exception for common sense, right? Let's think of another example besides self-interest. That's not St. Crispin's. You're thinking of Agincourt there. It's from the siege of Carcassonne, where the troops are going after Albigensians, and they say, how do we know, who to kill? And the order comes down, slay them all, the Lord will know his own, and so you kill 30,000 people. But I have seen people in this town with that on a T-shirt. Kill them all, let God sort them out. I have seen people in this. It was very popular in the era of the Iraq War. I have seen people in this town with that T-shirt. Kill them all. Kill them all. Let God sort them out. Now this tends to be the kind of person who subscribes to Soldier of Fortune magazine and is basically fantasizing about going overseas and plunging a bayonet in a person of color or something. But so we could make some assumptions about human psychology there. But we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to close up on the issue of trying to come up with another example of common sense that is not a universal. Because we're just teasing out. I want you to go back and really look on page 3 of these slides on arguments for realism, but and think about those and see if there are questions we need to explore in future classes. But we're going to come back and switch back to the problem of formal causation and look at some of our homework examples that way. Fair enough? We'll take a 5-minute break. Thank you. saying?
If nobody's happy, ain't nobody happy.
That's right. To which the corollary is what? Shit. That's the necessary corollary.
She must be obeyed.
Yeah. It's like, yeah. No, it's common. They're getting Walsingham stuff. Okay. It's just from last week. Okay. I want to leave you with another element of what could be common sense, what could be a universal. And then we're going to say, what's this look like? I'll clean it up. Stuff happens. Now, you can find a rather droll printout that has about 32 different varieties of that. And so it would say how this works in, I don't know, Presbyterianism, and it would say stuff happens because it's predestined to happen. And in Episcopalianism, it would say stuff happens, but it doesn't matter as long as you serve the right wine. And then, and then in Judaism, it would be, why does stuff always happen to us? And, things like that. It's quite amusing, and they don't clean it up. But What about that? Stuff happens. The TSH rule, that stuff happens. This is a real popular common sense around us, right? I mean, this is really... Right. And so in order to say that stuff happens, that stuff happens, we have to say what? That there is an element of randomness and that there isn't purpose and it is all random, right? Or? Okay. It happens because is another form of common sense, right? And so one of the ways you could explain stuff happens is stuff happens because you've been bad, right? Or stuff happens because, and you come up with a whole list of things. And these represent very common veins of human thinking in all history, including in our day and age, right? And so one of the problems we face in Christian denominations, not all, because some Christian denominations would be more than happy to say stuff happens because you've been bad. But one of the things we deal with is that there are a lot of people walking around who think that, stuff happens because you've done bad things. This is the argument of Job's friends, right, in the book of Job. They sit there and they say, you have to have done something. And here's what. And then what happens when God shows up in chapter 38?
Where were you?
Yeah, who is it that darkens counsel with these empty words? Were you here when I created the earth? It's like you guys are clueless, and you're not going to get an answer this way, right? And so, a common element of human experience would be that there are some things that we cannot, on the surface of it, come up with a rational explanation for. And so our option is to sit there and say, there is no rational explanation, stuff happens. Or we come up with rational explanations that are a lot of kind of ex post facto reasoning about, well, somebody has to have done something wrong, et cetera, et cetera. God rest their souls, poor people. But, when that limo crashed earlier in the week, leaving aside that you had something like 17 people inside the limo who became projectiles at least 60 miles an hour, and you don't want to see that picture. There are two people standing in the parking lot who've come out of the Apple Barrel restaurant and have a Ford Excursion stretch limo go into them at 60 miles an hour. Boom. Snuffed out. Gone, right? Bug on a windshield. How do you explain that? Okay? And so you get into the whole problem of theodicy, if you believe in God. Theodicy, Theodicicy, is the problem of the justice of God, right? Does God allow evil things to happen? Does God cause evil things to happen? One explanation that has always been popular in theodicy for, you get zapped by a Ford Excursion is, you displeased God. Another option is, it's random. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another option is, God does not cause evil, but he permits it because of the exercise of human free will. And we get into all those arguments. The reason I'm using that example of TSH as a bridge to our next discussion is to say, now we're talking about causation. And when we think of causation, we're always talking about basically proximal causation, proximate causation. Why did this happen? That's not what Aristotle's talking about, except at the end of the equation. So let's review what Aristotle is talking about when he talks about causation, formal causation, right? And if you go back to your slide, number 2 from last week, we see we have material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. And I've given an example of a table made out of wood and said, what's the cause of each one of these? Now, your homework was to come up with something and define the causes of it, and you're not allowed to use a table, and you're not allowed to use a rubber ball, because we used those last week. So who wants to bite on that one? Jim has done the homework, so he's going. Now I can sleep tonight, okay? Thank you. Yeah, okay. Well, would have a different formal cause, a different efficient cause, and a different final cause, but the material cause would be the same. Now let's take Jim's example, because within the last couple years we've seen passionate debate and at least one death in relation to the definition of final cause of statues. We had a woman get killed in Charlottesville, Virginia, in protests and counter-protests relating to Confederate statues. Elizabeth and I are from a part of the world where when we walk to Fountain Park for our Tuesday morning Bible study breakfast at the diner, we walk by a statue of a Union soldier facing southeast and think that's a little weird, because we're used to a Confederate soldier sitting there facing north with an inscription in Greek saying, "Go tell the Athenians," and etc. So most of those are gone, right? Because people decided that the final cause, the purpose of the statue, was not what somebody in a prior century said the purpose of the statue was. And the argument has been that actually what people said the purpose of the statue was when they put it up in the 20s or something was not its real purpose anyway, right? So if I have a statue of Stonewall Jackson up, and I say, well, people put this up to commemorate those who fought for a cause they believed in and to commemorate the number of people who died and their heritage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What those who would have a problem with the statue would say is, no, it's just perpetuating institutionalized racism. And actually the purpose of putting this statue up in the 20s anyway was part of perpetuating, institutionalized racism, an issue we're going to resolve any time soon. But it comes back to the problem of final cause. Because as human beings, what do we want things to have? Meaning, purpose, right? Final causation is the end or purpose of the thing. And when you start talking about a statue that's put up for a particular purpose that's conscious, that's an example of a final cause where a mind or committee of minds decided, here's the purpose of this thing. We're going to show those rebel so-and-sos that they're not going to make it this far north, right? Or whatever. When we talk about formal causation from an Aristotelian perspective, we're not talking about a human mind sitting there and saying, we're not necessarily talking about a human mind sitting there and saying, this is what I want this to be. If we go back to the example of a table that we used, we said that the final cause was that the table was made for dining. And so it's different from a drafting table. Oh, you could eat on a drafting table, right? You could do some drafting on a dining table. It's not a table for, come up with the different kinds of tables you could come up with. So there's an element of mind there. But Aristotle would have argued that independent of the fact that I intended this for dining, or for resting my hands upon, or for putting papers upon, or whatever, there's still a final cause in something that makes it part of tableness, right? So, as much as I like your example, let's dial the next step back from conscious purpose and talk about purpose that is independent of mind. Can a thing have purpose? We haven't discovered what its purpose is.
Let's see if this example works. I am made of skin, bones, and genetic material. That would be the material cause. It was designed to be, the genetic material designed to be human being in human form. The efficient cause, I can say that I was made by my parents. And the final cause is that I am here to live. Now, I don't know what the meaning of living and life is. And I can't say that's independent. I'm here to be alive. Would that be taking it down to beyond the tape or
Beyond the statue? It's getting there, but we're still not there. Because we're going to get into all kinds of arguments about what the purpose of living is.
But without defining like the meaning of life, we're just saying that the final cause would be to be alive as a human being, just to be alive. Whether that's to be something important, whether that's to be on a ventilator all my life and just barely alive, I am alive. So there's an aliveness of life.
And if I was a nihilist, I could say that your life has no purpose, right? And so, okay, that's my point. That we're conflating purpose with how we define purpose from a human perspective. And purpose in terms of final causation, the end of the thing, is not necessarily dependent on how the human perceives and values the thing. Now, let's take an example here.
Breathe in and out every lifetime.
There's no value. It's just
That's just being alive.
It's just being alive.
What is this? Now, this is a human artifact, okay? It's a human artifact. It contains water. It's made out of some kind of polystyrene-based plastic. Polyethylene, yeah. You're right. No, if it's polystyrene, it'd smash in my hand. What? Huh? Okay, thank you. Those of you with experience in injection molding, thank you. And it has other design elements in terms of what it looks like. Design elements in terms of the quantity of liquid it's supposed to contain, the thickness of the wall, whether the ribs are structural or decorative, how the screw threads work, all kinds of elements of design like that. If we take all of those elements of design out and say it's a bottle, a vessel, okay, a vessel. And in this case, it happens to be a closed vessel, but it doesn't have to be a closed vessel. Let's use the word vessel rather than bottle. And we say that the material cause of a vessel can be lots of things, right? It could be this type of plastic that we've just had our injection molding experts describe. It could be stone. It could be glass. And it could be a vessel that had a wall thickness of a fraction of a millimeter, or, I mean, it could contain the same amount of liquid and have walls that are meters thick, right? Wouldn't be necessarily the type of vessel I'd pick up and try to drink from, but if we define a vessel as that which contains something else, a quantity of something else, even if we say a liquid vessel, that which contains something else, we could come up with, for example, with a liquid vessel that would contain molten hydrogen. Right? We're doing fusion experiments here, and for brief nanoseconds, we're causing hydrogen to fuse in a way that it becomes something other than a gas, and it becomes a molten sort of state. Molten is not the right term here, but bear with me, a plasma state. And we're going to contain a plasma state in a vessel that is a magnetic field. It's, we're not going to come up with a material that's going to hold the plasma state of hydrogen. But a vessel in that sense is something that contains something else in some defined, way. And so the material cause could be a lot of different things. We could come up with all kinds of different actual physical things, materials, or a magnetic field, or theoretically something else. The formal cause would be that as we start getting to formal cause, we'd say it is a vessel that contains what quantity for what amount of time. And then we'd start worrying about things like the actual design, the thickness, the material, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The efficient cause would be how we made it. We had an injection blow fold seal or something like that. We had somebody who carved it. We had a glass blower. We had somebody who constructed superconducting magnets that were cooled by liquid helium to create a magnetic field for this amount of time in this space, in a vacuum. The final cause in all cases is what? No matter what we're containing and no matter how long, what is the final cause of a vessel? To contain something else. Okay. Well, okay, then we'd have to start saying, if we're defining what the form of a vessel is. Right. If we wanted to say what the form of a vessel is, for example, as I hand her water bottle back to Elizabeth, is this vessel designed to contain my keys? Right? So, yeah, it's just spirochetes. It's just Treponema pallidens, no big deal. Do they still make Salvarsan? No. Okay, so let's play with that. Is something that is, now we're talking about a human artifact if we're at an art show, right? So there's an element of conscious design in a human artifact. And when I make this thing and it has its design, I don't intend it to contain anything. Unless I'm making some kind of conceptual art where I'm saying that it's containing negative space or, things like that. But I don't have any conscious intent for that to contain anything. I just want it to establish a certain three-dimensional presence. Is that a vessel? Okay. So your argument would be that a vessel is a three-dimensional presence that defines space that is interior and space that is exterior to the vessel. And that might be a good working definition. We'd have to play with that. But once we start looking at the definition of a vessel, we're going to start arguing about final causation. What defines what a vessel is? What's it for? What? There's the problem. Once we start saying that things do have formal causes, and it's not random, then we start having to go down the problem of design. Now, how did Aristotle solve that problem? The unmoved mover. He says these are ideas in the universal mind, and we're talking about God. And so for a thing to be a vessel, for a thing to be a table, for a thing to be a ball, for a thing to be whatever the form of the thing is, and however we define that, these are ideas in the mind of God, and that they're universals and therefore external to us. They exist independent of whether or not we, thought of them. We have to discover the form of these things. We have to.
So, yeah, that seems to negate a personal idea being propagated by creating something that's not for initial. It's not that they're not vessel. Yeah, it's not a vessel. It's not a vessel. It has vessel, but it's not a vessel.
To come back to Tom's much more complicated example than a vessel, he was defining formal causality for humanness, right? Suppose, may God forbid, that we have a person born who's anencephalic. This happens once every 100,000 births, right? This person has no real brain. They function at a brainstem level, so the heart beats, the lungs work. There's no evidence of conscience. There's no evidence of thinking process. There's no evidence of perception in terms of being able to hear or feel. There is response to painful stimuli. And you can go back and read some pretty sick clinical reports on experiments on that basis. But is that a human?
Yeah, because that's what its genetic material is designed to be. And just because it doesn't have the capability of the average human person does not make it any less human.
Which takes us right to the problem of potentiality versus actuality, right? And so, if we define humanness with reference to things like genetic material that's programmed to say human, then we start looking at material causation. But are we looking there also at something that is teleological? What does telos mean in Greek? End, in the sense of what you're pointing to. So if something's teleological, it's pointing to a purpose, to an end. And so we'd say that this sequence of 46 chromosomes in pairs with these genetic sequences of the amino acids, et cetera, says human. Now, even though the human is not actualized into a way that we would say, can function. And even though we are leaving out the whole issue of whether or not the form of a human being is an immortal soul, which would be an argument that many philosophers would make. Aquinas would say, your body is, part of the accidentals. The form is the soul. But if we just go with the genetic argument here, what's our problem in our political debates?
Well, I just want to say that to rebut this, the final cause was to be alive.
Okay.
Whether you change that to humanness with purpose
Okay.
And what you define it as is to be human with a purpose. I think there's a difference.
Okay, there is a difference. You're correct. And so I could be a composite of living matter that is experiencing living and not necessarily be human, even though I might look like a human.
The living part, I don't know what the humanness is.
Okay, which is why we end up with problems of, mortal soul. The problem is if we start saying that DNA sequence is teleological, not in the sense of what kind of organism will result, but in the sense of whether or not that organism meets a definition of human, then we run right back into the problem that when Harry Blackmun in Roe versus Wade said that we can't tell when human life exists, now we've got a scientific problem because the science has moved on from when Harry Blackmun made that statement, right? And so we get into all kinds of moral arguments over abortion and whether or not there's a human being involved. Now, that's a different set of arguments, but you see why final causation and why formal causation can cause us a lot of problems. And so one option in terms of dealing with the problem of final causation is to just deny that it exists and say it's random. There is no such thing as purpose. There is no such thing as final causation. There is no such thing as end. Now, we don't ever actually behave that way. We just define some things that we don't value as not involving purpose and some things that we do value as involving purpose. But the logical consequence of denying final causation is then it's got to be random, right? Which means I'm random, which means you're random, which means this is the problem we're struggling with, right? In all human thinking now, not just in the 21st century in America, but in all human history. This is why we're saying, is it permanent? Is it changeable? Are we dealing with actuality? Are we dealing with potentiality? Are we dealing with only that which we can perceive and use inductive reasoning in? Or are there logical principles that are external to us that we have to discover, like universals, and say, here's what points to reality beyond perception? This is why we're actually doing this course, because all of the arguments we get into over the existence of God, over the life after death, over the existence of a soul, over the existence of morality external to human societal agreement, these all turn on the issue of causation ultimately. And once we start chucking out the ideas of causation, then we can become very good deconstructivists and say all statements are exercises in power, and this is just, an exercise in power. And so I can say that as a self-actualized human being, male, heterosexual, 21st century, from this background and this culture, whatever, I have these privileges, and I can decide, to use this hot button example, that genetic sequence in that womb is not a human being. If we say that we can ignore causation, that's a perfectly logical statement to make, right? Now, different question is whether I can decide whether the person whose womb that genetic sequence in has a say in this, right? But causation is going to cause us all kinds of problems. And so our answer to this for quite a long time now has been to just chuck it out and get into some kind of power struggle that could be academic or involve weapons as to who gets to decide what. And then it does become just an exercise in power. Once we start saying that there is anything that is objective and that we have to discover and that we're not in charge of, and that is not just an exercise in our power, then all bets are off in terms of who gets to define what, whether it's God or, some other definition we might come up with. So you see why we're kind of beating this universal issue to death and why we're beating this causation issue to death? It's not just because there's so many little hairs we can split. It's because pretty much all of the rest of what we're going to talk about in terms of how we think about ultimate reality is going to turn on where we fork in these paths. And once you chuck out, I'll use a shorthand term here, but not a totally accurate one. Once you chuck out any kind of Aristotelian worldview of how you start exploring reality, you start going into a bunch of loops that become power statements. And so I completely agree with the deconstructivists like Jacques Derrida that most human thinking involves power statements from a certain point of time forward. Because until you get to the point where you chucked out formal causation, then you might not be dealing with power statements. You might be dealing with something objective. That's where our arguments are going. Now, everybody's looking kind of like, huh? So let's get some reactions. Sure. As long as you sit there and say, how we believe in the Bible or the Quran or the Zendavesta, or, we could come up with all other kinds of holy books, holy writ, that are defined to be holy writ in particular societies, times, etc. We could make the argument is made very commonly, that this is just, how human beings have decided to express their organizing principles, and it's an exercise in power. And we could, slice and dice the Bible endlessly over that, which people do. Or we could sit there and say, well, actually, no, this has been revealed to us by an all-powerful, all-sentient, all-knowing being, God, and it's revealing who God is and what God's will is for us, and therefore we have to pay attention. And we could make that same argument whether we were Christians or Jews or Muslims. We'd say, you've got to pay attention to this. This is revealed. Anybody who's not a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim would say, who gets to decide what special revelation is? When was it decided? How you decided it is an exercise in power, and so that's why we have a patriarchal narrative here or something like that. And that's where our arguments loop back and forth, because you either say that there is some form of special revelation, that it was something that was revealed to us and not something we just thought of, and then you argue about what it is, or you say that's not possible, in which case that's all just, people arguing about power and putting power structures in place.
I guess the part I'm confused about is aren't all three of those major religions you referenced working from this Aristotelian worldview?
Yes, they are all working from the worldview that says there is knowledge external to us that's objective. Oh, they're still disagreeing about the content of what the revelation is, right? So if we were to take Islam as an example, Islam would recognize pretty much all the prophets that are named in what we call the Old Testament, and would recognize Jesus as a prophet. Has more to say about the Virgin Mary than the Bible does. Refers to the Jews as the people of the book. Says Jesus is the Messiah who will come back at the end times, but the Messiah is not quite the same thing as how the Messiah is defined in Christianity, right? The basic argument of Islam would be that God, in revealing who he is and what his will is, said this to the prophets, said this to Jesus, and said this to Muhammad. That the revelation continued and was not complete until it was made to Muhammad. Now, a Mormon would say Joseph Smith, right? And right. I mean, it's the problem of what's called the problem of the closed canon. at what point does revelation stop? And then you say, here's what God's revealed. And so a good Muslim would say, well, it didn't stop with what you call the Old Testament. It didn't stop with what... They would, yes. They'd say it does stop at some point. And there are others who would make other definitions.
Then Christians know Bible at Book of Revelation mentioning that in addition to add to this,
and that would be, if I was going to make a deconstructive argument, I would say that the verses at the end of Revelation that say that anybody's accursed who adds or subtracts here is a classic power statement to say we get to define. Now, let's take Christian Science as an example. How does revelation happen in Christian Science? Well, Mary Baker Eddy, right, got certain revelations and said, this is how we're going to... If you go to the First Church of Christ Scientist in Boston, which is a beautiful place downtown, and if you were to get into the office of the president of the First Church of Christ Scientist, what would you find there? A telephone from the 20s that is wired to her grave. The idea being that there could be a call that would come in with some more revelation, right? I am not aware of any Christian Scientist making the argument that a call has been received, but the phone's there. If you were to go to a Muslim, however, and say, we're looking for a particular way to communicate with Muhammad, and he's going to reveal it to us through this receiving device, you would probably not get a favorable reception by making that argument. In the late 70s, there was an assassination in Salt Lake City with a guy getting blown up in his car. Why? He was arguing for the existence of additional tables beyond the tables that Joseph Smith said he had. So the problem of when the canon closes becomes very much a power statement. But that might be just a human power struggle. It might not be what God's really doing if we're coming up with a common conception of God here, right? Because tomorrow, if we got up and we got a revelation of something in addition to the Bible, is that possible in God's providence? Sure, right? The question becomes, how do you know it's happened, right? So under Roman Catholic canon law, one has to be extremely, extremely cautious of what's called private revelation, right? We get scripture, we get reason, we get tradition, capital T. Private revelation is possible. I can have a mystical experience, but boy, do we have to test it to see if it comes into the sensus fide, the sense of the faith of overall Catholic teaching. And different denominations and traditions would have ways of deciding whether or not the Holy Spirit did speak to you, or if it wasn't the Holy Spirit, the angel Moroni or the angel Gabriel or something. You know. So yeah, the problem of the closed canon becomes very real. The point about dealing with causation, though, is all canons assume something that's teleological. If it's not having a purpose or an end, who cares? Right? I could, sit there and say, I've come to you with the ultimate truth. Raspberry. Right? And you're like, what? He's on something, but in the right language and the right view of reality, raspberry could be the ultimate truth. And you could say, no, it's not, it's blueberry, So the problem of the canon becomes real. Now, we've run out of time tonight, so let's try to say, where are we going with this? And what are we going to do next week? Which takes us to the syllabus. And that means that next is the 18th. We've already started there. How does the concept of causation relate to the concept of God? 18 October. So now we're going to start looking at, within this framework, if you reject the idea of formal causation, you don't get to these arguments, okay? That's why we're saying this is thinking theologically. than thinking philosophically. But within a frame of reference that says we're going to talk about formal causation, now we say causality in God, the reasons for the existence of God, arguments from first cause, teleology's mindedness. How do we distinguish this from intelligent design arguments? So, what is your reading? Who's got the book? Let me see the book a minute. So, by the 18th of October, it will help you in discussion if you've read, we really don't need to go beyond the first 4 questia. So, logic and methodology, metaphysics, natural theology, and cosmology. What? Yeah, review it. We're a long way away from physical anthropology and epistemology, so. And is there homework? Let's think of homework for a minute. We've talked about formal causation. We've talked about universals. What will we include? Okay. I want you to construct a syllogism for the existence of God. Ooh, Lord. There you go. Now, let's go back. If we say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That would be a simple syllogism. And so if we want to come up with the simplest possible syllogism. You can use whatever you want. Simplest possible syllogism that says, here's a reason why God exists. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. Because once we start getting to the reason for the Holy Trinity, we're going to get off on a whole bunch of different... Now, just God. However you want to define God as, universal creator, universal mind, universal being, universal source, and some, whatever you want to do with that. Start trying to think about a syllogism for the existence of God. And we'll be back next week. Now, just quick process check. Anybody interested in bringing a snack next week? Okay, thank you, Marianne. We can make that happen. We can make that happen. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Exactly. I still like Monty Python's definition of a king. He's the one who doesn't have shit all over him like the rest of us, right? Okay, I'll give one for you.